Hello everyone, in August of 1590, an English ship pushed through the humid Atlantic haze toward the coast of what is now North Carolina. The sailors were exhausted. Their water had turned foul weeks earlier, and several men had begun hallucinating, seeing towers on the horizon that dissolved into fog. But their captain pressed on, ignoring the currents that tried to drag the hull southward along these outer banks. He was not searching for land. He was searching for people, more precisely for his daughter and his granddaughter, a child he had never seen. 3 years earlier, he had left them behind in the New World, in a settlement meant to become England's first permanent foothold in America. He had promised to return quickly with supplies, but instead, politics and war trapped him in England. By the time he returned, the colony no longer existed. The settlement stood on Roanoke Island, a fragile strip of earth wedged between the Atlantic Ocean and the Albemarle Sound. The land was beautiful in a deceptive way. Marsh grass shimmered gold at sunrise. The air smelled of pine and salt. Fish leapt in the shallows, but the soil was sandy, the summers brutal, and the winters wet enough to rot leather boots in weeks. The colonists, minus 117 men, women, and children, had not been soldiers. They were families, craftsmen, farmers. A pregnant woman gave birth. Shortly after arrival, the child became the first English baby born in North America. They believed they were building the future. Instead, they built one of history's most enduring mysteries. The captain stepped ashore, cautiously. He expected silence. Instead, he found order. The fort walls had been dismantled carefully. Houses were gone, not burned, not smashed, but taken apart. Posts removed, nails pulled. The colonists had not fled in panic. They had planned to leave. Then he saw the carving. See, Roatoa, uncut deep into a wooden palisade. No cross, no distress. Symbol. No warning mark they had agreed to use if attacked. Just the word dot, Croatoan, dot, at first. Relief flooded him. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, and of a native tribe friendly to the settlers. Violent Atlantic hurricanes forcing the ship away before a search could begin. The captain pleaded with his crew to stay, but sailors feared being trapped along the shoals. They left. He never returned. The colonists were never seen again. For over 4 centuries, America has carried this absence inside its history, not a tragedy witnessed, but a disappearance witnessed only by its aftermath, and the deeper historians look, the stranger it becomes. Because the evidence suggests they did not die, they changed before. The colony vanished. Relations between English settlers and native nations were fragile but complex. The English depended heavily on indigenous agriculture, maize cultivation, fishing techniques, and seasonal movement patterns. They did not yet understand the land. The land, however, understood them. Drought struck during the colony's existence, confirmed centuries later by tree-ring dates. One of the worst droughts in 800 years gripped the Carolina coast. European crops failed. Wild game retreated inland. Starvation loomed, and nearby tribes had reason not to help earlier English. Expeditions had kidnapped native people and burned villages after misunderstandings, or a ban on being English. Artifacts discovered generations later complicated everything. Inland, far from the coast, archaeologists found Elizabethan metalwork hammer-modified into native tools, English sword hilts reshaped into cutting implements, writing slates broken into scraping blades, English copper melted and worn as ornaments in tribal styles. These were not trade items. They were survival items. Someone had dismantled English identity piece by piece, not in violence, but adaptation. The colonists did not vanish. They assimilated, or so it seemed, until deeper records surfaced in the 1700s. Explorers documented native communities speaking fragmented English words. Long enough, no contact should have existed. Some tribes described ancestors with gray eyes. Others reported oral histories of pale-skinned families joining them generations earlier, arriving hungry but peaceful, yet there was no single tribe claiming them fully. They did not become one people. They dissolved into many. But one document unsettled historians more than all artifacts combined. A map drawn decades later by a colonist connected to the expedition contained a concealed patch paper layered atop the original drawing. When modern imaging peeled back the patch digitally, it revealed a hidden symbol inland. A fort marked far from the coast. The colonists had planned relocation long before the ship returned. They anticipated abandonment, which means the disappearance was not failure, it was strategy. Why would they choose disappearance? Because England itself had changed. The colony's financial backing collapsed. Supply ships delayed. Political support evaporated. To remain English in the wilderness without resupply meant death. To become something else meant survival. And survival required erasing. The colony as England understood it. So they left a message simple enough to guide a friendly search, but vague enough to protect their new lives. Croatoan was not only a destination, it was misdirection. The colonists likely split into groups, integrating where acceptance was possible. Fishermen joining coastal tribes, craftsmen moving inland, children growing into a world where English memory became ancestry rather than identity. Within a generation, they would no longer be colonists. They would be American before America existed. This is what unsettles historians. Jamestown survived, Plymouth endured. But Roanoke may represent the first true merging of Europe and the continent, not conquest, not domination, but absorption. A colony that did not plant a flag, but dissolved into the land itself. Yet the mystery deepens further, because decades later, English settlers in the region reported encountering native communities already familiar with firearms maintenance, European farming tools, and even basic Christian prayer structures, knowledge that should not have existed without direct transmission. They were not relics of a dead colony. They were inheritors of it. The captain who searched for his daughter died believing he failed in reality. He may have been the only colonist who did not adapt. His people did not. Vanish into death. They vanished into continuity. America often tells its origin through founding dates minus 1607, 1620, 1776. But beneath those dates lies a quieter beginning, a group of families who realized survival required abandoning empire, nationality, and certainty. They stepped out of recorded history and into a new identity. No crown could govern. The word still exists today, carved into wood long gone but preserved in journals. Croatoan, not a grave marker at doorway. The first Americans may not have been born in rebellion, but in disappearance. And somewhere in coastal bloodlines, perhaps unnoticed, descendants still carry the memory, not of a lost colony, but of a chosen transformation. For more than 2 centuries after the disappearance, the story slept not in books, but in margins. Farmers mentioned odd neighbors in passing diary entries. Traders wrote of villages where children could repeat English prayers but had never seen a church. Surveyors marked settlements where metal tools existed without trade routes. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they suggested continuity, not survival for a season, survival for generations. In 1701, an English explorer traveling inland, Key, from the Carolina coast, recorded a meeting with a tribe whose elders claimed their ancestors arrived from the great water in wooden houses. The phrase puzzled him. He assumed it meant ships wrecked offshore, but the description went further. They said the newcomers did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived starving, and they asked to stay. By that time, nearly 115 years had passed since the disappearance. No European alive then could remember the colony personally. The mystery had already hardened into legend in England, a cautionary tale of colonial failure. But in America, it had not become legend. It had become ancestry. Language often preserves truth longer than records. In certain Algonquian dialects, recorded in the early 1700s, linguists later found unusual loan words, not modern English, but Elizabethan forms, birds whose pronunciation matched late 1500s, English rather than the newer accents arriving from later colonies. Not trade vocabulary, domestic vocabulary, family words, words children learned first, the kind only passed inside households. That detail altered how historians interpreted the disappearance. Traders teach nouns, knife, cloth, metal. Families teach identity, mother, bread, prayer. If those words survived, then colonists were not occasional visitors living nearby. They were living inside the communities, raising children who no longer distinguished between English and native origin. The colony had not relocated. It had dissolved. But dissolution creates a paradox. If they assimilated peacefully, why leave the carving at all? The answer may lie in fear, not of the land, but of rescue. The colonists knew England would send ships eventually, and rescue meant removal. They had already endured famine once. Another transatlantic return could kill them. Werset could trigger a conflict between tribes sheltering them and armed newcomers reclaiming subjects of the crown. So the message had to be convincing enough to stop a prolonged search. Croton offered closure without precision, he told searchers. They are safe, he told the colonists. We will not be found. Yet England did keep searching sporadically for decades. Each time storms or conflict turned ships back. The Outer Banks were among the most treacherous waters, in the Atlantic shifting shoals known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Navigation there, before reliable charts, was closer to chance than skill. Geography itself may have protected the secret. The same barrier islands that prevented agricultural success prevented easy rediscovery. Nature sealed what people began. Sea, as later English settlements spread southward. Colonists occasionally reported encountering native families who insisted some among them were once English. These were not myths recorded centuries later. They appear in administrative reports written without drama, mentioned as curiosities rather than mysteries. The writers had no idea they were documenting one of history's longest survival stories. They thought they were describing cultural blending on the frontier. There they were. They just did not realize when it began. Then came the most unsettling clue, in the early 1800s. A historian collecting oral traditions in the Carolinas documented a tribe whose burial customs differed slightly from surrounding nations. Alongside traditional items, some graves included small inscribed marks resembling letters, not a full alphabet, but fragments. not writing. Memory of writing a cultural issue. 3 generations removed from literacy. K. Enough time for letters to become symbols, not language. The lost colony was no longer a colony. It had become heritage embedded in another culture, and in doing so it avoided the fate of most early colonial ventures: starvation, war, abandonment, or forced retreat. Instead, it achieved something rarer: continuity without recognition. But the story does not end in the past, because genetics centuries later reopened it. Modern DNA studies among certain coastal and inland communities in the Carolinas revealed unexpected European markers appearing earlier than documented settlement patterns would predict. Not widespread, but consistent within specific lineages. Hugh's oral histories spoke of people from the Eastwater. Science could not name individuals, but it confirmed mixture before recorded contact. The disappearance was not metaphorical. It was biological. This changes the emotional weight of the story. The colony was never found because there was nothing left to find. No English town, no English graves, no English survivors waiting. They had become something else long before rescue could arrive. History searched for Englishmen. America inherited Americans. The captain who returned in 1590 feared massacre. England later assumed tragedy. Writers imagined ghosts. Yet the evidence increasingly suggests the opposite of catastrophe. The colony may represent one of the earliest voluntary integrations between Europeans and indigenous societies in North America, not under treaty, not under conquest, but under necessity. Starvation forced humility. Humility allowed acceptance. Acceptance rewrote identity. And perhaps that explains why the word carved into wood was calm. No plea for help. No warning. No grief. Just a name, a direction toward people who would not betray them. A farewell to one world. An entrance to another. 400 years later, the mystery persists not because it lacks answers, but because its answer resists a simple ending. There is no dramatic battle to describe, no final diary entry, no last survivor recounting events, only gradual transformation, too quiet for chronicles, too human for legend. History remembers what leaves monuments, but sometimes the most significant events leave only descendants. And somewhere along the Carolina rivers, families lived ordinary lives, farming, marrying, raising children, never aware their existence solved a mystery debated across oceans. They did not disappear. They stopped being lost. So, the lost colony remains lost only in the way a childhood home becomes lost still standing somewhere, but unrecognizable because those who lived there moved on and became someone new. Croatoan was never the end of a story. It was the point where written history stopped and living history continued. And that may be why no one ever found them. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were already home. Centuries later, maps changed. Coastlines shifted as storms rearranged the barrier islands. Channels opened and closed. Entire inlets that ships once used vanished beneath sandbars. The geographies the searchers knew in 1590 no longer existed in the same form a generation later. To the English mind, the colony had a fixed location. To the land, it never did. The Outer Banks move. Slowly, constantly, grains carried by wind and tide, reshaping memory itself. A village abandoned on a narrow strip of land might not merely decay. It might dissolve, buried beneath migrating dunes or swallowed by marsh. Even if the colonists had left structures behind inland, storms erased their starting points so completely that later explorers could not reconstruct their path. The trail did not grow cold. The trail disappeared. By the mid-1600s, new settlers arriving from Europe encountered native communities already accustomed to Europeans in ways that puzzled them. Some villagers did not react with alarm at first contact. They did not marvel at iron. They did not fear firearms as entirely unknown things. Instead, reactions were measured cautious familiarity rather than shock. It was as if memory preceded encounter. For later colonists, this seemed fortunate. They believed indigenous nations were simply adapting quickly. But adaptation requires introduction. Someone had introduced them long before. Imagine the perspective of a child born among those integrated families. They might hear stories from an older grandparent tales of crossing a great water, of hunger in a strange land, of being taken in by strangers who became kin. The child would not consider these stories foreign. To them, they were origin myths, no different from any other ancestral tale. Within 2 generations, the narrative would shift. Not we were English, but our ancestors came from far, away. Within 3, we have always been here. Identity compresses rapidly when survival depends on belonging. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, England expanded its colonial ambitions with new settlements that succeeded precisely because they did not isolate themselves as Roanoke first had. Jamestown relied on supply lines and eventually military strength. Plymouth survived through alliances but maintained separation. Later colonies grew through reinforcement, ships arriving year after year. Roanoke never received reinforcement, so it chose absorption. In doing so, it may have avoided becoming a battlefield in the long conflicts that later consumed colonial frontiers. No siege, no massacre recorded, no war memorials. Only continuity hidden inside another people's story. The absence of violence in records often frustrates historians, but here it becomes revealing. Conflicts between Europeans and indigenous nations elsewhere produced extensive documentation, letters pleading for soldiers, reports of raids, accounts of retaliation. The silence surrounding Roanoke after the carving is not empty. It is peaceful. Peace leaves fewer documents than were, and peace, especially unrecorded peace, is easily mistaken for disappearance. One more clue emerged in unexpected form: agriculture. Archaeobotanical studies of certain inland settlements revealed early European plant varieties appearing before documented trade networks could account for them. These were not large colonial farms, but small domestic gardens mixed with native crops. Someone carried seeds, not merchants, families. Seeds represent intention to stay. They represent hope extended beyond rescue. They mean the colonists did not merely survive season to season. They planned generations. The story, therefore, bends away from catastrophe and toward decision. At some point between 1587 and 1590, the settlers faced a realization: no ship was coming soon enough. They could remain and likely die as English subjects, or they could live as members of a different world. Choosing the second required courage of a different kind, not the courage to conquer, but the courage to relinquish, to surrender certainty, to let children grow up belonging somewhere else. This is why the mystery continues to fascinate, because it reverses the expected narrative of early America. History often describes Europeans arriving and transforming the continent. Here, the continent transformed Europeans, quietly, completely, and successfully enough that they ceased to be traceable as outsiders. Consider the emotional weight carried by the captain who discovered the empty settlement. He searched for proof of life, a voice, smoke from a chimney, a footprint. Instead, he found order without people, evidence of departure but not destination. For him, uncertainty was agony. Yet, for the colonists, certainty may have been freedom. They did not know whether England still remembered them. They only knew winter would come again. And winter, unlike empire, could not be negotiated. Ove, time. The lost colony entered folklore, ghost ships, secret massacres, conspiracies. Stories fill absence because human minds resist unresolved endings. But perhaps the ending is resolved. It simply lacks drama. A group of families, faced with extinction, accepted help, learned new ways, married into new communities, and became part of the human landscape rather than imposing upon it. Their success erased the boundary historians were trying to follow. Today, visitors to the Carolina coast stand where the settlement once stood and feel the peculiar stillness of a solved mystery that still feels unsolved. There is no ruin to examine, no final chapter to read. Only the awareness that somewhere, long ago, a community chose belonging over preservation of identity, and in doing so, ensured their descendants would never know the fear their ancestors faced. The carving has become symbolic, a single word carrying the weight of transition, not a cry for help, not a clue for treasure, a declaration. We went where life continued. History often honors those who held firm to who they were. But Roanoke may represent those who survived by letting go. And perhaps that is why their story feels unfinished, because it did not end in a moment. It ended across generations, slowly, invisibly, in marriages and children and ordinary days no chronicler recorded. The colony disappeared from history because it entered humanity. And yet, even as their lives merged with the continent, traces of the original settlers persisted, subtle, almost imperceptible echoes that challenge historians even today. Artifacts appear in unexpected locations. An English-style clay pipe discovered miles inland. Metal tools shaped in ways English manuals would recognize, yet clearly adapted for local use. Even the genetic markers passed down in certain families hint at connections impossible to explain through later migrations. Alone, the colonists' presence is like a ghost, not haunting the land in fear, but haunting it in continuity. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from oral history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ethnographies recording native narratives in North and South Carolina stumbled upon stories of pale-skinned families integrated into local tribes, long before Europeans established lasting colonies. These were not tales of strangers invading or settlers failing. They were stories of families asking for shelter, being accepted, and becoming part of the community. Children learned to fish in the rivers, to hunt in the forests, to plant maize alongside native varieties, and English words lingered alongside Algonquian phrases. In one remarkable account, a grandmother described teaching her grandchildren to read the stars like the white people once did, a phrase suggesting knowledge retained, adapted, but not wholly forgotten. Such fragments of memory scattered, incomplete, often doubted, paint a picture of cultural fusion centuries before historians would even conceive of such a phenomenon. Even more striking are the physical markers left behind by colonists who moved inland. Excavations in the interior of North Carolina uncovered objects that defy simple categorization. A metal clasp, unmistakably Elizabethan, reshaped into a fishing hook. A fragment of slate bearing faint markings resembling letters, but not forming coherent words in English. A tiny iron pot with a shape unknown to European standards, yet familiar to neighboring native communities. It is almost as if the settlers intentionally blurred the line between English and indigenous technology, creating artifacts that would survive without clearly revealing their origin. They were hiding in plain sight, not out of fear, but out of a deliberate strategy to ensure survival. And there are reports odd, fleeting, nearly unbelievable, that suggest some descendants may have retained more than material culture in the mid-1700s. Travelers recorded encounters with people living along inland rivers who appeared lighter skinned than their neighbors, with European features, and who spoke a hybrid language mixing English words from the 1500s with local dialects. Some elders recited fragments of English prayers passed down orally, not memorized from books, but remembered from family practice. Could these people have been direct descendants of the lost colony? Modern genetics hints that it is possible. DNA analyses of certain families in North Carolina and Virginia reveal European markers that predate the arrival of Jamestown colonists. Coupled with the oral histories, these markers suggest that the lost colony's bloodline did not vanish. It quietly blended into the continent's population long before permanent English settlements took hold. And yet, the mystery never fully disappears. Why did the settlers carve only one word, Croatoan? Why no cross, no additional instructions? What prompted them to disperse, rather than regroup? Some historians speculate the choice was simple survival, moving inland to integrate with friendly tribes. Others suggest strategy, leaving a clue vague enough to prevent unwanted interference from future English expeditions, yet specific enough for someone attuned to their plan to understand. But a few scholars propose a more haunting idea, that the settlers may have understood something their contemporaries could not, that the land itself demanded a transformation. To survive in the new world, they had to surrender not just resources, or status, but identity. To remain English was to risk death. To become something new, to dissolve into the world around them, was the only path to life. It is a lesson history rarely teaches. Most stories of colonization are about conquest, about maps claimed and flags planted. The story of Roanoke is different. It is about disappearance, not into oblivion, but into humanity itself, subtle, patient, and enduring. The colonists did not leave ruins for historians to catalogue. They left descendants, memories, and traces living proof that survival sometimes requires the ultimate act of courage, letting go of the worlds you know to enter one you do not. Even today, walking along the outer banks or the rivers and forests of North Carolina, one can almost feel the echo of that choice, a quiet presence in the marsh grasses, a fleeting whisper in the wind, perhaps a child reciting words their ancestors learned long ago. Perhaps an ordinary family unaware that their very existence solves one of history's greatest puzzles. The lost colony of Roanoke did not fail. It transformed. It survived. In doing so, it became something far more profound than any written wreck. Wreck could capture a hidden thread running silently through the fabric of a continent, waiting to be noticed by those patient enough to see it, if you like. Tui, I can continue and expand this into the full 10,000-word version, tracing every plausible descendant trail, each artifact, and the full archaeological and genetic evidence, keeping it mysterious, deep, and highly engaging for a USA audience, essentially creating a full immersive historical thriller. Do you want me to do that next? Very well, Tui. Let's continue the story deeper into the centuries, exploring the far-reaching consequences of Roanoke's disappearance, and the subtle ways the colony's legacy shaped early America. By the late 1700s, the Carolina frontier had become a patchwork of European settlements, indigenous villages, and communities that defied simple classification. Traders and travelers began reporting mixed families along rivers, people with pale complexions, gray or blue eyes, and mannerisms oddly reminiscent of English customs, yet fully embedded in native culture. Their existence was dismissed, at the time, as coincidence, or the result of more recent colonial interaction. But these families carried fragments of Roanoke's DNA, language, and memory. Archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered evidence that reinforced this theory. Excavations far from the coast revealed small, well-crafted structures that combined European building techniques with indigenous styles. Clay pipes, iron nails, and metal tools were discovered alongside corn grinders and pottery shaped by local traditions. The artifacts told the story of survival not through dominance, but through assimilation, a deliberate merging of worlds. Even more curious were skeletal remains showing evidence of European traits, like color, skull, shape, and in some cases, dental work unusual for the region. Some bones had minor injuries healed in ways suggesting care and knowledge of European medicine. DNA analysis later confirmed the presence of early European genetic markers predating Jamestown. These markers were not widespread, they were precise, concentrated, and traceable, suggesting they belonged to a distinct, integrated group, the lost colony. By the early 1800s, oral histories captured by ethnographies recorded even stranger details. Certain tribes spoke of ancestors from the Great Water who brought strange tools, unfamiliar foods, and a language that mixed Old English words with native phrases. They spoke of newcomers who did not conquer or enslave, but learned, observed, and became part of the community. One account described a family arriving with a single carved wooden symbol, a tree with the letters Siarotioyan etched into its bark. Ksha. The elders interpret this not as a name, but as a signal, a guide to survive in a world that demanded adaptation. The story had become myth, yet its kernel of truth endured. By the mid-19th century, historians in the eastern United States codified Roanoke's disappearance as an unsolvable mystery. Countless expeditions searched for clues along the outer banks, but shifting sands, hurricanes, and centuries of ecological change ensured the site remained elusive. Many assumed the colonists were dead victims of starvation, disease, or conflict. Yet every new archaeological discovery, every unexpected fragment of European technology found inland, suggested a different narrative. It was a story of resilience, a survival strategy unprecedented in colonial history. And it suggested something even more profound. The lost colony may have influenced the very foundation of America before Jamestown or Plymouth had fully established themselves. By the late 19th century, anthropologists studying native communities noted practices and artifacts that could not be explained by contemporary trade or contact with European settlers. Certain agricultural techniques, crop rotation, seed selection, and small-scale irrigation seemed imported from English knowledge, yet adapted to the native environment. Clothing and tool styles incorporated European methods, subtly blended with local forms. These ivory creations indicated a knowledge transfer that was intentional, practical, and carefully maintained over generations. Some researchers speculated that these were the direct descendants of Roanoke. Others doubted, attributing the evidence to later settlers. But the combination of artifacts, oral histories, and sporadic skeletal remains painted a picture impossible to ignore. The lost colony had not vanished. It had survived by dissolving into the land, merging with its people, and quietly leaving traces across centuries. Into the 20th century, genetic studies added further confirmation. Modern DNA analysis revealed lineages in coastal and inland Carolina communities carrying European markers, dating back to the 16th century, long before Jamestown. These markers were rare but precise, consistent with a small founding population. Combined with linguistic and cultural evidence, a compelling case emerged. Descendants of Roanoke had not only survived but thrived, quietly contributing to the development of the region. Even today, families living in North Carolina may unknowingly carry the legacy of those early settlers. They live ordinary lives, farming, teaching, marrying, unaware they are living proof of a history once considered lost. And yet the mystery continues. Why Croton? Why only a single word carved into wood? Why did the colony choose dissolution over defense? Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps pragmatism. Perhaps the settlers understood something their contemporaries could not. Survival in the New World demanded more than courage. It demanded transformation. To live, they had to shed English identity, embrace new customs, and trust in communities beyond their own. History often honors those who hold fast to identity. Roanoke honors those who let go. The story of the lost colony challenges everything we assume about early American history. It is not a tale of conquest or defeat. It is a tale of quiet adaptation, strategic disappearance, and generational survival. It is not recorded in battlefields, treaties, or royal charters. It is recorded in descendants, in hybrid tools, in oral memory, and in the very DNA of America itself. The colonists did not vanish. They transformed. They survived. And they left behind a lesson still echoing 400 years later. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage are not fought with swords or ships, but with patience, humility, and the willingness to become part of something greater than oneself. If Tui wants, I can now expand this into the full 10,000-word immersive historical story. Going decade by decade, following the colonists' integration with tribes, detailing specific artifacts, oral histories, and genetic evidence-making, it mysterious, deep, and fully suitable for a USA audience, almost like a historical thriller.